Most people look at a mid-60s Volkswagen and assume it's slow, simple, and predictable. But the 1964 VW Type 3 quietly shattered those assumptions. And it didn't need big power, exotic engineering, or muscle car bravado to do it. In fact, this humble 48 horsepower car was never meant to embarrass anything or anyone. Yet it did. Its performance wasn't supposed to raise eyebrows, spark debates, or challenge what enthusiasts believed about Volkswagen's engineering. But when the numbers came in, suddenly everyone had questions. The Beetle's golden handcuffs. 82 miles per hour. In a modern context, that figure sounds almost pedestrian, barely enough to keep up with traffic in the left lane of an interstate. But you have to look at this number through the lens of 1964. We are talking about a compact economy car powered by an air-cooled engine that produced in its most aggressive trim about 63 horsepower. In its base form, it was making even less. By all the laws of automotive physics governing that era, a vehicle with that little power should have been wheezing, vibrating, and straining just to touch the speed limit. The Volkswagen Beetle, the car that built the brand, was famous for exactly that struggle. A Beetle driver in 1964 was fighting a war against wind resistance just to maintain 70 miles per hour downhill. Yet, here was the Type 3, utilizing the same fundamental engineering DNA, cruising effortlessly at 82. It defied the logic of the time. It wasn't just about raw power, because frankly, it didn't have any. The secret was a combination of aerodynamic efficiency and a bizarre, flat engine architecture that completely changed the packaging game. But before we tear that engine apart, we have to understand why this car even exists, because it was born out of pure corporate paranoia. Transport yourself back to the 1961 Frankfurt Motor Show. To the outside observer, Volkswagen looked like an unstoppable juggernaut. They were exporting Beetles to every corner of the globe, and the Type 2 bus was becoming the workhorse of Europe. But inside the Wolfsburg boardroom, the atmosphere was thick with anxiety. Heinrich Nordhoff, the man at the helm, knew they were walking a tightrope. Volkswagen was a monoculture. Their entire global dominance relied on a single passenger car platform that was designed before World War II. It was loud, it was cramped, and by the standards of the swinging 60s, it was archaic. Nordhoff and his engineers knew that consumer tastes were fickle. If the world suddenly decided they wanted cars with actual heating systems, proper trunks, and modern styling, Volkswagen would be wiped off the map overnight. The Beetle was a pair of golden handcuffs. It was making them rich, but it was preventing them from evolving. The debut of the Type 3 was their escape plan. This wasn't just a new model year refresh. It was a fundamental strategic repositioning. They needed a car that signaled to the world that Volkswagen could grow up. They needed a vehicle for the middle class, something with more comfort, more cargo space, and a look that didn't scream 1930s economy car. But here is where the strategy gets interesting. Despite the desperate need for modernization, they didn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. They kept the soul of the engineering intact. The Type 3 retained the air-cooled, rear-engine, rear-wheel drive layout. It kept the torsion bar suspension and the body-on-chassis construction. This was a calculated risk. They needed to leverage their existing parts bins and service networks, but they had to wrap it in a package that looked like the future. The rollout was aggressive. It started with the Type 31 notchback, a traditional two-door sedan that finally gave VW owners a car that looked like a car. Then came the Type 36 variant, or the Squareback, as it became known in the States, which we will get to later because it revolutionized utility. Finally, they dropped the fastback, the touring limousine. They were suddenly running three distinct chassis lines, the Type 1, Type 2, and Type 3, simultaneously. It was a massive investment and a logistical nightmare, but it proved that Volkswagen wasn't just a one-hit wonder. They had built a bridge to the future, but to make it work, they had to solve a massive problem: the pancake engine packaging miracle. The biggest problem with the Beetle was never reliability, it was geometry. If you owned a Beetle, you knew the struggle of storage. You had that small, awkward bin behind the rear seat and a front trunk occupied mostly by the fuel tank and spare tire. The reason for this lack of space was mechanical. The standard Volkswagen air-cooled engine was tall. It had a massive upright fan shroud that stood up like a tombstone, dominating the space behind the rear axle. You could not put luggage back there because a giant cooling fan was spinning right where your suitcase wanted to be. This was the fundamental engineering wall Volkswagen had to break down to make the Type 3 viable. Their answer was the EA122, a power unit that would become legendary simply as the pancake engine. The engineering team took the basic concept of the flat 4-boxer engine and radicalized the packaging. On the Beetle, the cooling fan sat proudly on top of the engine block, driven by a belt. For the Type 3, they amputated that height. They moved the cooling fan to the end of the crankshaft, tucked low and tight against the block. They relocated the generator and redesigned the entire cooling air intake system to lay flat. The result was an engine that was barely taller than the transmission it was bolted to. It was a masterpiece of compression, maintaining the displacement and reliability of the older design, but occupying a fraction of the vertical space. This architectural shift allowed for a feature that felt like a magic trick to buyers in the 1960s: the dual trunk. When you opened the rear deck lid of a Type 3, you did not see an engine. You saw a carpeted floor. A full-size luggage compartment existed directly above the engine bay. You had a trunk in the front and a trunk in the back, all while carrying the engine with you. In the fastback model, this meant you had over 10 cubic feet of storage in the rear, hidden between the parcel shelf and the motor, plus another 6.5 cubic feet up front. This was not just a minor adjustment. It was a total reimagining of what a rear-engine car could do. It proved you did not need to sacrifice utility for the traction benefits of a rear-engine layout. The engine itself was not just smaller, it was smarter. They bumped the displacement up to 1,500 cubic centimeters, largely by lengthening the stroke compared to the smaller Beetle unit. But even with more power and a more complex cooling arrangement, they kept the weight down by casting the block and major components from advanced aluminum and magnesium alloys. A fully dressed 1,600cc version of this engine weighed only about 289 pounds. That lightness was critical. It meant the car remained agile and fuel efficient, delivering around 27 miles per gallon. The mathematics of 82 miles per hour. We need to have a serious conversation about speed. In the American muscle car tradition, speed is a function of violence. You take a massive V8, you dump raw fuel into it, and you bludgeon the air out of your way. German engineering in the early 1960s took a diametrically opposite approach. They treated speed as a math problem, specifically a problem of efficiency. This is why the 1964 Type 3 1500S model is such a fascinating case study. On paper, it looks underpowered. In reality, it was a masterclass in doing more with less. Let's look at the numbers, because they tell a confusing story if you don't understand the context. The base model Type 3, with its standard single carburetor 1,500cc engine, was pushing out roughly 45 metric horsepower. That is about 44 horsepower in SAE terms. Even with that meager output, it could hit nearly 78 miles per hour. But the real shock came with the introduction of the Twin S model around 1964. This was the hot rod of the lineup. Volkswagen slapped on twin downdraft carburetors, high compression pistons, and aggressive accelerator pumps. The result? A towering peak output of 63.5 horsepower at 4,800 revolutions per minute. Now, 63.5 horsepower does not sound like the stuff of legends, but that engine pushed the Type 3 to a cruising speed of 82 miles per hour. To put that in perspective, a contemporary Beetle with a 1,300cc engine was struggling to break 70. The Type 3 was leaving it in the dust, and it wasn't doing it with brute force. It was doing it by cheating the wind. The primary villain in high-speed driving is aerodynamic drag. The force of drag doesn't just increase with speed, it squares with speed. The faster you go, the harder the air fights back. The Beetle was an aerodynamic disaster in disguise. Yes, it was round, but it had articulated fenders, running boards, and headlights that stuck out into the airstream. It was churning the air, creating turbulence that sucked energy away from the engine. The Type 3 was different. It adopted what designers called ponton styling. This was the modern slab-sided look, where the fenders were integrated into the body, creating a single smooth envelope. The air didn't get caught on headlights or running boards. It slipped over the nose and down the sides. This lower drag coefficient meant that every single one of those 63 horses was being used effectively to push the car forward rather than being wasted fighting the atmosphere. Then there is the gearing. This is where the German Autobahn philosophy really shines. In American cars of the era, top speed was a theoretical number you could hit for 10 seconds before the engine exploded. For Volkswagen, top speed and cruising speed were the same number. The Type 3 was designed to sit at its maximum velocity all day long. The transmission used a very specific set of ratios. First gear was a short 3.80 to get the car moving. By the time you hit fourth gear, you were in an overdrive ratio of 0.89. This tall gear allowed the engine to spin at a comfortable RPM even at 80 miles per hour. Coupled with the engine's flat torque curve, offering 106 Newton meters of torque at just 2,000 RPM, the car didn't feel strained at speed. It just settled in. It was a victory of engineering precision over raw power, proving that if you are smart enough about drag and gearing, 63 horsepower is all you need to shock the world. Taming the deadly swing. Axle. Going 82 miles per hour is impressive, but it is completely useless if the car tries to kill you the moment you encounter a curve. This was the dark cloud hanging over the rear-engine revolution. For decades, the Achilles heel of the Porsche and Volkswagen design was the swing axle suspension. It was a simple, robust system, perfect for cheap manufacturing and driving on rough farm roads, but at high speeds, it had a nasty habit of biting the hand that fed it. To understand why the Type 3's evolution was so critical, you have to understand the physics of a swing axle. Imagine the rear axle is just a rigid tube pivoting directly from the transmission. When you enter a corner fast and the weight of the car shifts, or if you suddenly lift off the throttle, the rear wheels do not just compress, they tuck under. The camber changes drastically. The outside wheel, which is carrying all the load, suddenly rides on its sidewall rather than the tread. The rear of the car jacks up, the tire loses grip, and the heavy engine in the back acts like a pendulum, swinging the tail around. This is the infamous lift-off oversteer. In a 40 horsepower Beetle doing 50 miles per hour, it was manageable. In a Type 3 doing 82, it was a recipe for disaster. Volkswagen knew that if they wanted to sell the Type 3 as a legitimate highway cruiser for the modern family, they had to fix this dynamic flaw. The solution was the introduction of the independent rear suspension, or IRS. This was a massive departure from the primitive architecture of the past. Instead of a single pivot point at the transmission, the new system used semi-trailing arms and, crucially, constant velocity joints, or CV joints. The magic of the CV joint is in the name, constant velocity. It allowed the axle to articulate at 2 points, both at the transmission and at the wheel hub. This double-jointed design meant that the suspension arm could move up and down to absorb bumps without forcing the wheel to tilt inward. The semi-trailing arms kept the wheels relatively flat against the pavement, regardless of what the chassis was doing. This change transformed the character of the car. With the IRS setup, the rear wheels stayed planted. You could enter a corner, hit the brakes, or accelerate without the suspension geometry fighting against you. It eliminated the dreaded tuck-in phenomenon. The car felt composed. It absorbed road irregularities rather than hopping over them. This chassis refinement was the unsung hero of the Type 3's performance stats. The upgraded engine and the aerodynamic body provided the speed, but the independent rear suspension provided the confidence. It allowed a driver to actually use that speed, without fearing that the rear end would suddenly try to pass the front end on a wet off-ramp. Forbidden fruit, the gray market. If you were a car enthusiast in Europe in 1961, you could walk into a dealership and drive away in a brand new Type 3. But if you were in the United States, arguably Volkswagen's most important export market, you were out of luck. For 5 long years, between 1961 and 1966, the Type 3 was a ghost. It existed in magazines and rumors, but you couldn't buy one from your local dealer. This gap in the timeline created one of the strangest chapters in VW history, the era of the gray market. The reason for this blackout wasn't a conspiracy. It was bureaucracy and logistics. Volkswagen of America was a victim of its own success. Their dealer network was massive, but it was built entirely around the Beetle and the bus. Every mechanic in every service bay across America knew how to fix an upright fan engine with their eyes closed. They had the tools, the parts, and the training. The Type 3, with its pancake engine, was an alien invader. It required new specialized tooling. It required different diagnostic procedures for the cooling system and the twin carburetors. Volkswagen of America looked at the cost of retraining thousands of mechanics and stocking millions of dollars in new parts, and they blinked. They decided they simply weren't ready. they were also terrified of the price point. The Type 3 was significantly more expensive than a Beetle, placing it dangerously close to domestic American compacts that offered more power and size. But nature abhors a vacuum, and car enthusiasts abhor being told no. The official embargo didn't stop the cars from arriving, it just drove them underground. A robust gray market emerged almost immediately. Savvy buyers realized that Canada, with its Commonwealth ties and different import regulations, was receiving the Type 3 much earlier than the US. So, a steady stream of notchbacks and squarebacks began to trickle across the northern border. This scarcity did something powerful for the Type 3's reputation. Because you couldn't just buy one off the lot, owning a Type 3 in 1964 became a status symbol. It was the forbidden fruit. It signaled that you weren't just a commuter, you were an insider. You were someone who knew enough about cars to go through the hassle of importing a vehicle personally. Auction records and registration data from the mid-60s show these gray market cars popping up in hotspots like California and Florida years before the official launch. The Squareback revolution, utility, and culture. While the engineering world was obsessing over the pancake engine's technical specs, the American public fell in love with what that engine allowed them to carry. The Type 3 notchback was a handsome sedan, but the Type 36 variant, better known in the States as the Squareback, was a revelation. It was the ultimate expression of the platform's potential, a vehicle that somehow managed to be smaller than a domestic compact on the outside, but larger than a luxury sedan on the inside. The numbers are staggering when you consider the footprint of the car. Because the engine was flattened entirely beneath the rear floor, the Squareback offered a completely flat, unobstructed loading bay. With the rear seats up, you had nearly 25 cubic feet of space in the back, plus another 8 cubic feet in the front trunk. But the real magic happened when you folded that rear seat down. Suddenly you were looking at 42.4 cubic feet of cargo volume. To put that in perspective, this compact German wagon offered more usable interior volume than many of the bloated, 20-foot-long American land yachts parked next to it at the grocery store. It was a triumph of space efficiency, proving that you didn't need a massive car to haul massive amounts of gear. This specific combination of economy, reliability, and cavernous space hit the American market at the perfect cultural moment. The Squareback became the unofficial chariot of the West Coast counterculture. It was the surfer's upgrade. The Beetle was too small for gear, and the VW bus was slow and drove like a bread loaf in a crosswind. The Squareback was the Goldilocks solution. It handled like a sports sedan thanks to that independent rear suspension. It could cruise at 80 miles per hour on the highway, and critically, it could swallow a surfboard whole. In California, the Squareback became the platonic ideal of a beach car. It was cheap enough for a high school kid to afford, reliable enough to drive down to Baja, and spacious enough to double as a bedroom. With the rear seats folded flat, the cargo area was long enough to sleep in. You could toss in a shortboard, a sleeping bag, and a cooler, and you had a mobile base camp that got nearly 30 miles to the gallon. It bridged the gap between the hippie aesthetic of the Beetle and the suburban practicality of the station wagon. Electronic brains and the legacy. We have spent a lot of time talking about the mechanical innovations of the early 60s, the carburetors, the aerodynamics, and the suspension geometry. But the Type 3 had one final card to play, and it was a card that would fundamentally rewrite the rules of the automobile industry. In the late 60s, specifically around 1968, Volkswagen did something unprecedented. They took the Type 3, a car rooted in 1930s engine architecture, and gave it a computer brain. They introduced the Type 3E, where the E stood for Einspritzung. This was the moment the carburetor began to die. The Type 3E became the first mass-produced German car to feature electronic fuel injection. This wasn't a mechanical injection system like you might find on a high-end Mercedes race car of the era. This was the Bosch Digitronic system. The D stood for Druck, or pressure. It was a speed density system, a concept that still underpins how millions of cars run today. Instead of relying on the crude vacuum of a carburetor to suck fuel into the engine, the Digitronic system used a central engine control unit, an analog computer, to make decisions. It worked by using a manifold absolute pressure sensor, or MAP sensor, to constantly read the load on the engine based on intake vacuum. It combined this data with engine speed signals from trigger contacts in the distributor, and critically for an air-cooled engine, cylinder head temperature data. The ECU would process all these inputs in real time and fire the fuel injectors for a precise duration, known as the pulse width. This was space-age technology for a family wagon. It allowed the air-cooled engine, which notoriously struggled with temperature management and emissions, to run cleaner and smoother than ever before. It managed the delicate balance of fueling a hot engine without spewing unburnt hydrocarbons out the tailpipe, essentially saving the air-cooled platform from being banned by emerging US emission regulations. This brings us to the legacy of this strange, wonderful machine. The Volkswagen Type 3 is often remembered as the awkward middle child, the bridge between the iconic Beetle and the modern, water-cooled Golf and Passat. But to dismiss it as a transitional model is to miss the point entirely. The Type 3 was a masterclass in engineering resilience. It took a pre-war design philosophy and dragged it, kicking and screaming, into the modern era. Think about what this car achieved. It proved that you could take a low-power engine and, through the sheer force of aerodynamic efficiency and intelligent gearing, make it cruise at speeds that shocked the world. It debunked the myth that horsepower was the only path to performance. It demonstrated that a rear-engine layout didn't have to mean zero cargo space, inventing the pancake engine to give us the miracle of the dual trunk and the cavernous utility of the Squareback. And finally, it pioneered the digital revolution under the hood, standardizing the electronic fuel injection systems that would eventually become mandatory on every car sold in the developed world. The 1964 Type 3S might have shocked everyone with its 82 mile/hour top speed, but the car's true power wasn't on the speedometer. Its power lay in its ability to adapt. It showed that Volkswagen wasn't just a one-trick pony building, buggies for the masses. They were a serious engineering powerhouse capable of solving complex problems with elegant, unconventional solutions. The Type 3 didn't just keep the company alive during the roaring 60s, it built the technological foundation for the Volkswagen we know today.